Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sports Dadcast. I'm your host, Bo Bingen, and with me tonight I've got a very special guest, a guy we go back a long ways. Mitch Luedtke is here. Thanks for being with me, Mitch.
Yeah, Bo, it's excited, or I'm excited to be on. I know when you shot me a Twitter DM earlier this week and asked if I'd come on, talk some college football semifinals as well as some Packer Vikings, I was all for it. I seem to be my weekend plans always seem to be laying on my couch for 10 hours a day watching football. So excited to kind of talk through these.
Yeah, and I know I follow you on Twitter, and we've been friends kind of since grade school. At least so we played a lot of sports against each other, anyways. So I know how closely you follow this stuff. So I was really excited to have you on. We're going to talk about the two college football semifinal games, and then we'll follow up with some Packer Vikings. Big game up at Lambeau, lot of playoff implications. The NFL season coming to a close, but we'll get right into it. TCU versus Michigan in the VRBO Fiesta Bowl Saturday, 12:31 at 3 p.m. Central Time. Michigan coming in as a big 7.5 point favorite. What are your thoughts on this one, Mitch? The line opened at 7.5. It's been bet down to 7.5. What do you think? Do you give TCU any kind of a shot against Michigan?
Yeah, no, it's going to be a really interesting game. It feels like TCU has kind of been this an underdog story the entire year. It feels like as they've kind of progressed through the Big 12 and kind of had their undefeated march until they lost in the Big 12 championship game, it felt like a lot of their lines weren't really they weren't really as favored as they should be, being an undefeated team as they kind of ran through the Big 12 ranks. So
Right.
really excited to see if Max Duggan can kind of continue his magic. His kind of he was in the Heisman conversations, and it feels like Michigan's defense, who is by all means a top 10, top 5 defense in all of college football, if Max Duggan can score some points to keep that game close, because like you said, 7.5, I think it opened at 9, is a pretty big line for a semifinal game. So kind of excited to see what Max can do against probably the best defense he's going to face to date. So excited to see him.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a game that coming in, I think being that it opened at 9.5, I don't think there's a whole lot of people that expect TCU to even have much of a chance. I caught a couple of their games and I really wasn't all that impressed with TCU. But man, they have had quite the season. And it was interesting because I caught the first Kansas State game when they played them in the middle of the season. And Kansas State went through a couple of different quarterbacks in that game, but it was close the whole way, and TCU kind of pulled away at the end. And then the Big 12 championship, man, that was a classic. Did you have a chance to watch it?
I did. Yeah. The way kind of TCU stormed back at the end there, scoring like those 10 points within the last like 5 or 6 minutes. I mean, to your point, they have played in a lot of close games this year. I think,
Yes.
outside of their non-conference games, I think they blew out maybe Iowa State. And other than that, every other Big 12 team they played seemingly was a one-score game that came down to the last possession. So they've had the ball bounce their way a lot. I
Hmm.
will say that I don't think the Big 12 is kind of the run and gun, high scoring kind of offenses. So I would say that this is by far the best defense they'll face. So it'll be interesting to see if they can kind of score the way they did in the Big 12 against Michigan's highly touted defense.
Yeah, and they've played a couple of different styles too. If you look back at the Texas game that Kansas State played, it was real tight. It was low scoring. It was kind of a slobber knocker, if you will. A lot of defensive blows being thrown around, but they pulled out that one too. And then you get to like the Kansas State or the Baylor game where it was a little bit more high scoring. So they've played a lot of different styles. They've won a lot of different games, and it seems like no one gives them a chance. But that's when Max Duggan kind of does his thing, and he wills that team to victory. And you got to think that he's going to be healthy in this game and ready to roll.
Oh, definitely. And their TCU by all means too is what I would feel like is a big play offense. Quentin Johnston, who is their number 1 wide receiver and who will probably be a top 15, top 30 pick in the draft. I think he's averaging close to 20 yards per reception. Their second best receiver, Tay Barber, is also I think he's averaging like 17 yards per reception. So it feels like if TCU can kind of nail some of those big plays and shock Michigan's defense, that may be kind of their recipe to keeping this game close and ultimately covering that 7.5 spread.
Yeah, and, going into Michigan then, they kinda are, like you said, the big bully. Jim Harbaugh has kinda built them like he did the Stanford team when he was there, and that San Francisco 49ers team, when he was over on the West Coast as well. They are the new bully on the block, it seems like, and not just in the Big Ten, but in all of college football. He's built that team to kinda hit you in the mouth and see if you have a response, and it seems like that's kinda what they did to Ohio State. They, I think, were underdogs in that game, and they came out in the second half and just took it to Ohio State. So I think that's what we kind of see in this one too, is that TCU keeps it close in the beginning, but I think Michigan has enough to kind of pull away in the end.
Yeah, and the way underdogs have been hitting in all the college bowl games, I know the semifinal, and once you get into the playoffs and you don't have guys sitting out or, just entering the transfer portal, I would say most of these teams will be at pretty full strength. I know Blake Corum's out for the year with kind of his injury, but
Mhm.
it sounds like Donovan Edwards is going to play. So to your point, right, Michigan's probably going to want to just to continue to punch TCU in the mouth. But I think the interesting thing about Michigan for me, and it's something that we didn't see all year until that Ohio State game, is what JJ McCarthy is going to show up, right? Because McCarthy in that Ohio State game, I think, had a handful of big plays that kind of shocked
Yes.
Ohio State. Ohio State was
Yep.
like, they want to play this smash mouth football, which they did, but it feels like Michigan separated because McCarthy had, three or four pass completions that felt like they were over 50 yards that Ohio State ultimately couldn't keep up with. So if TCU wants to win this game, they're going to have to limit McCarthy's big plays. And if Michigan's going to play smash mouth football, TCU is just going to have to answer with that intensity.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody really expected that out of the Michigan offense, especially going up against Ohio State. It felt like more of a game in which Michigan was going to try and pound the football, which they eventually did, but they kind of came out and started running the football. But off of that, got a bunch of big plays, like you said, and Ohio State really didn't have an answer, and they couldn't keep pace. And there were a couple of costly turnovers in that game by Ohio State that let Michigan kind of run away with it in the second half. But I think if there's anything that you can look at, it's Michigan's run offense. And I know you, like you said, they're not going to have quorum, but I think Michigan's run game versus that TCU run defense, which hasn't been good. They give up roughly 150 yards on the ground a game. So comparing that to Michigan's run offense, I think it's going to be too much, and Michigan runs away with this one.
Agreed. If TCU wants to stay in this game, it's going to have to be the low scoring game. I know TCU has scored in the Big 12, but to the kind of point earlier, TCU hasn't seen a defense like Michigan. So I would think that if TCU feels like they're playing their game, this is going to have to be a game in the low 20s. Once we start trending to the 30s, 40s, I don't know if TCU's offense can kind of keep up with that, given how good Michigan's defense is.
Yeah. So it sounds like you might like TCU plus the 7.5. Am I getting that vibe right from you?
Yeah, I am. I think that in 7.5 is an interesting line because if I could give you a final score, I would say it'll be like 30-23 or something along those lines. So we're getting very
Sure.
close to that line, but I think that half point gives me the lean towards TCU if I'm kind of betting straight up and not buying half points.
Yeah, Mitch likes the TCU Horned Frogs plus the 7.5, and it sounds like the under is where you're leaning as well.
Yeah, it just feels like the semifinal games, nerves, all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if we will see the big plays that JJ kind of had against Ohio State, which would make me to think that this is going to be a lower scoring game.
Sure. That over under is currently sitting, I think, at 58.5. So that would put us under that total. And I kind of lean that way as well. But if I had to guess, I think Michigan is just too much, both defensively and then offensively on the ground. I think this could be, like you said, a low scoring game, but I think it's Michigan. And I would say it's probably 30-20. So I would actually take Michigan and I would lay the 7.5. But we'll see. It's going to be a fun one. I'm really interested in this one. I think this is the more interesting game because I think it is more of a contrast of styles, but I think Harbaugh's group is more flexible in this kind of spot. So I like the Wolverines to pull this one out. Any
Agreed.
uh,
Yeah.
any any last
Just
thoughts on the Michigan one?
Yeah, one final point. I mean, to your point on Harbaugh, it felt like this over the last 2 years is kind of the first time we're starting to see Harbaugh kind of break through. It felt like
Yeah.
He was, when he came in right away, he started to kind of trend in the right direction. Michigan started to consistently get back to, what they used to be, but his Achilles heel was always not beating Ohio State and getting left out of kind of the playoffs because they couldn't get past Ohio State. Now you're starting to see that change a little bit.
Yeah.
So, I feel like this would be very, very good for Harbaugh if he can get past this and get to a national championship game.
Yeah, and he's a coach that's had a lot of success both at the NFL and at the college level. And I like to root for him. I think he's a little bit of a corny guy, but I think that kind of plays in college football. So I'm rooting for Jim to get one. He lost to his brother in the Super Bowl, so I'm rooting for him to get a national championship at Michigan. Although I don't really care for Michigan, but I would like to see Harbaugh get one.
I'll expect to see a picture of you wearing khakis on Saturday then.
I will have the khakis on. I think I'm going to wear a Wisconsin red shirt, but I'll have the khakis on for Harbaugh. So let's flip over the second game, the night game, the primetime game. Some might say the more anticipated one, Ohio State versus Georgia in the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl. That's Saturday at 7 Central Time. We'll see if it starts on time, but we'll be ready for that one. So Georgia coming in, the line opened at 7.5 or excuse me, it opened at 7 and it hasn't moved much. It has crossed over that 7 to Georgia -6.5. So it seems like Vegas got that line right away. The over/under is sitting at 62. What do you think about this one, Mitch? Where do you line or lean on this one?
Yeah, this one's really interesting. I think I've been, as we've kind of progressed through bowl season, I've been pretty bullish on taking the dogs just because it feels like, in these non-semifinal games, just kind of the other bowl games, it felt like, it's harder for those teams to get motivated. So
Yeah.
I've been actually pretty consistent on dogs, but I do think that this will be one of the few remaining bowl games that we have left that I do take the favorite. It's just one of those things where I don't know if Georgia has really ran into a talent comparison. I know Ohio State has some awesome weapons offensively with their wide receivers, with Marvin Harrison. CJ Stroud's obviously really good, but I think what you'll see in the Ohio State Georgia game is Ohio State's going to run into a team that basically what Michigan did to them, but kind of on steroids, right? Georgia is just a better, bigger, stronger, more athletic version of Michigan. So if they have the big plays with Brock Bowers and others, I just don't know how Ohio State's offense, given all the weapons they have, can kind of keep up because of how good Georgia's defense is.
Oh, I'm with you 100%. Ohio State got big boyed by Michigan, and they're coming up against even a bigger bully in Georgia. So I like the dogs to run away with this one. Georgia really only got tested this year in a game kind of in the middle of the year. It was maybe a look ahead game. I don't know. It was against Missouri. They were down 16-6 at half. But then won the second half 20-6. But it was close. That game ended 26-22 Georgia over Missouri. That was really their closest game all year. If you look at the score, it says it was close, but that game really wasn't close either. Georgia dominated that game. There were a couple of turnovers that kind of let Missouri hang around. But yeah, I think this is, you're right, Georgia's biggest talent comparison, you could say, or closest talent comparison. But I think that they're too good right now. Kirby Smart's got them going in a direction that is just beautiful football. And I think Georgia's too much for Ohio State. And I think the biggest part of this is Georgia's defense. Points per game allowed this year, 12.8. So they're not even allowing a touchdown and 2 field goals in an entire game. I think that's absolutely incredible. And I think it's way too much for Ohio State.
Yeah, no, and you talked about the defense, and it's kind of centered around Jalen Carter, who's their big D tackle. He's going to be a top 5 pick in the draft, and as soon as he starts getting pressure on CJ Stroud, CJ is going to start trying to, he's not going to be able to hang on to the ball. He's going to start hearing footsteps, that kind of stuff. So if Georgia can get pressure on CJ early, it feels like he's not going to have enough time to kind of get the ball down the field to Marvin Harrison and a couple of their other really good wide receivers. But I do want to say, if Ohio State does have any chance, it will come to the fact that Ohio State's offensive line has kind of the game of the year and is able to give CJ Stroud some time, because we talked about, you ran through Georgia's schedule and not really being tested this year. And it felt like even their close games, they were kind of just toying with teams or having some turnovers. But the game that I go back to is actually the year before, and I know Georgia's defense is different, but the one thing that they were susceptible to, and I think their secondary is a little bit susceptible to, is an elite pass game. And that's something Ohio State does have, because Alabama kind of went toe-to-toe with Georgia last year, and Bryce
Okay.
Young was slinging the ball all over the field. So if Stroud can get time and get the ball to Harrison and others, I think we may see the game closer. But I'm with you on the fact that I just think Georgia's too good and they'll definitely cover that 6.5.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. So we both like Georgia in this one, and plus we'll lay the 6.5. As far as the over under goes, the total on this one 62. I think this is probably an over. I think it's probably high scoring, but I think Georgia does the bulk of the work from a scoring perspective. I could see this one getting to 42-28, something like that. Um, but I don't think it's particularly close. I think Georgia controls the majority of the game, and Ohio State does what they can to hang in there. But I think it's just too much.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that over. It feels like Georgia, it's kind of will kind of have that cushion 2 touchdown-ish lead where they end up building a lead, and then maybe Ohio State kind of has a couple of late scores where the game's kind of out of hand at that point, but they kind of help get that over. So I do like the over too, just given Ohio State's big play ability, but it feels like those big plays will kind of come after Georgia's up multiple scores.
Yeah, I'm with you. So let me quick ask you this. And I didn't prep you on this at all, but I'm curious your thoughts on Stenson Bennett. I think he's 25 at this point. Do you think he's a guy that ends up in the NFL, or do you think he's just a college QB?
I mean, he's a really good college QB, and he seemingly always makes the right decision. I could see him being who was the last Georgia quarterback that they had that kind of stuck around in the NFL for a little bit. Jake Fromm. He
Oh,
had I
sure.
think
Yeah,
5 or 6 years. I don't even know if he's still in the league as kind of a backup. I could see Stenson being that guy. I don't know if he'll
sure.
ever get a shot to be a consistent starter. But just given, seemingly he always is just making the right decisions, I think that's worth something, especially, from a backup. You could come in, you could learn the system. And if he were thrown into a situation in the NFL due to injuries, I think he could manage an offense. But
Yeah.
I don't know if he has the kind of high-end playmaking ability that you need for the NFL.
I'm with you. Yeah, it seems like he could be a guy that kind of point and shoot, maintain an offense, game manager type deal. But yeah, he could be a guy that floats around on some practice squads or whatever, maybe sit as a third string guy for some teams. But yeah, at 25, I don't think anybody's dropping a second or third round pick on Stenson Bennett.
Right. No, I'm with you.
Sure. So we both like Georgia. We both like Michigan. If you had to pick out of the four teams, what would be the national championship that you would want to see?
I mean, strictly from a ratings perspective and just seeing the fan bases going back and forth, and I'm sure the NCAA is probably hoping it plays out that way. I think a Michigan-Ohio State rematch in the national championship could be something college football fans dream of, arguing that, that's the biggest rivalry in college football, having
Yeah.
them playing on the biggest stage after Michigan embarrassed them at Ohio State a couple weeks ago. I don't think that happens just given how good Georgia is. But if I could dream up a scenario, a Michigan Ohio State rematch in the national championship would just be very fun to just be not a fan of either team, obviously, but just fun to watch as a general college football fan.
Oh, I'm with you. I think it would break the internet, or at least come close. Oh my gosh, would that be yeah, like you said, a dream for college football fans? It would be a lot of fun. But yeah, I think this ultimately ends up being a Georgia Michigan rematch, in which it did not go well for Michigan the last time those two teams met up in the playoff. Real quickly, do you give Michigan any chance if that's the matchup that we end up seeing?
I think the line would be very similar to what we're seeing with the two semifinal games. I think Georgia would be favored by 7 or 8 points. And
Yep.
it kind of comes back down to, I feel like if Michigan, and I don't want to feel like a broken record with this, but it would feel like if Michigan would want any chance, JJ McCarthy would have to play the way he did against Ohio State, hitting some big plays, catching, Georgia kind of on their heels type situation. Because I
Sure.
don't think Michigan, given their identity of big boy football, you can't big boy football Georgia. So
Yeah.
that game would solely fall in the hands of JJ McCarthy playing the game of his life.
I'm with you. I'm with you. Yeah, you're exactly right. You don't get to bully the bully.
Yeah.
That's not how it works in football. It doesn't quite work that way. So, Mitch and I, we differ on the TCU Michigan game. Mitch will take the TCU in the 7.5. I'll lay the 7.5 with Michigan, but we both like the under in that one. As far as the Ohio State game with Georgia, we'll both take Georgia and lay the 6.5, and we both like the over. So, interesting. We'll see what happens on Saturday afternoon, Saturday night. Um, and we'll get ready for the national championship then. I think that's the following Monday, right?
Yeah.
I think there's 8 days or whatever in between, 10 days, something like that. So, all right, let's flip over. Let's talk some NFL. You and I both Packer fans. The Packers sitting at 7-8. They host the Minnesota Vikings, who are sitting at 12-3. Sunday afternoon, they are the Fox game of the week, up at Lambeau at 3:30. The weather's looking okay. I think it's going to be decent. We might see some 40-degree weather at the end of December, which is interesting. But it should be a little balmy here in central Wisconsin. The line sitting at for this one, the Packers favored by 3.5, which I think is a little surprising. Mitch, what did you think of that line when you saw it? Packers Vikings Packers favored
Yeah,
by 3.5.
it kind of seems like the Vikings feel like the TCU version of the NFL, right? Where
Yeah.
they're winning a lot of close games where they're having a player to bounce their way. I know they just had the kind of massive comeback against the Colts. But the Vikings are a really interesting team. It's obviously very out there in the public that they kind of have about an even point differential or it
Hmm.
might actually even be negative. Kind of one of those things where for a team that is fighting for the number one seed in the NFC, they're seemingly coming down to, regardless of how good the team they're playing against, it comes down to that final possession. They're a really interesting team. Justin Jefferson, I think you can make the argument, is the best wide receiver in the league, and he absolutely gashed us in week 1. So I don't know if you saw the comments today, but Jair had he had voiced his opinion. I think he gave Justin Jefferson his credit, but he was very stern to say that wasn't happening this week. So it'll be
Okay.
interesting to see how Joe Barry kind of mixes that up, if he allows Jair to follow him a little bit more and kind of switches up from his soft zone, because I don't think that if the Packers do want to win this game and if they do want to cover 3.5, they can't just let Kirk sit back in the pocket and pick apart our zone, because I think that spells trouble for Green Bay.
I'm with you 100%. So quickly on the point differential, and I want to come back to this because I think it's absolutely incredible and it's actually historic for the Vikings. So the Packers point differential at 7-8 is -21. So they've given up 21 more points than they've scored. The Vikings at 12-3, 12 wins, 3 losses, have a point differential of +5, which is historically low for a team that has this many wins this late in the season. So you are exactly correct. All of their games seem to be coming down to one possessions, and the games that they've lost, they've kind of gotten blown out. But being so close in a point differential, not much difference between the two. I was shocked to see that the Packers were favored by 3.5. But when you look at some of the numbers, and I don't really like to get into DVOA and all the analytic numbers,
Yeah.
but the Packers are a significantly better team when it comes to DVOA, which is probably why you're seeing this line at 3.5. And being that you're getting the hook, if you're the Vikings, the field goal and the hook, what do you like about this game? How do you feel? Where are you leaning?
Yeah, I may have bought back into a team that I was seemingly at, 5-6 weeks ago. I was like, just lose out, have a top 3 pick so we can get a stud. And now I'm to the point where I'm like, okay, if we get into the playoffs, as long as we don't run into San Francisco, I like our chance to make some noise. That could be very biased of me. So I will take the Packers and the spread, just given the run they're starting to go on. It looked like the offense really started to click in Miami, and you're starting to to kind of see what, some had predicted early in the year, right? When you still have the back-to-back MVP, it feels like every game they should win.
Yep.
The team obviously has some holes, and the defense has had some issues, and obviously we've had some issues, but it felt like with our weapons being so young, it just was a matter of time with them getting reps with Rodgers to start clicking. Obviously, we need Christian Watson to play, and we need the offense to be healthy. But I do think that if those guys play, that you do see the Packers end up covering the spread.
Okay. All right. Good. So Mitch likes the Packers by more than a field goal, which I think is where I'm leaning with this one as well. I know it was a long time ago, but week one, I think we're looking at two very different teams. And more so in the Packers. When you look at the Packers, I think this team is very, very different than what it was in week one. And specifically on offense, I think it was a little bit of a mess starting the year, trying to get the new wide receivers involved, trying to get everyone acclimated. I don't think Rodgers was quite as good, but you get that out of week one, Rodgers. I think we're a much more well-rounded team. I think you see a lot of Aaron Jones out of the Packers this week, especially being at home, a lot of Aaron Jones. And a couple of quick numbers about the Packers defense, which might surprise people. So the Packers pass yards allowed on average this year, 192.4. So that, I mean, the pass defense has actually been pretty solid, which is, it's kind of surprising when I went through these numbers because, like you mentioned, with Barry's soft zone, it doesn't feel like that when you watch games. What would you agree?
Oh yeah, I'm right there with you. And actually, when you kind of said that, I kind of perked up a little bit. It is interesting, and it's I feel like that's one of those things where, I mean, our secondary they have a lot of guys in that secondary that can play. Douglas, Jair, those guys are legit corners, and it felt like, I think that stats sometimes can be misleading. It depends, kind of how game flow goes, and if other teams have, been able to run the football against us, they, have no reason to throw the ball. But I do think
Right.
that your point, right? Minnesota, if they want to get Jefferson going, that's kind of one of those situations where if Joe Barry switches up and allows Jair to shadow him a bit more, to your point, we have guys that can make plays in the secondary. So
Mhm.
I wouldn't mind it getting to that point. So it'll be interesting to see how things have changed since week one, because week one, we couldn't for the life of us stop Justin Jefferson. So
Yeah, it was pretty ugly. He kind of gashed us big time, and it kind of felt like even in just the first half that it was going to be a rough day because he kind of got whatever he wanted. So something quick to compare, the Vikings defense, 31st in the NFL as far as yards per game allowed, 402 yards per game allowed, which is 31st in the NFL, only in front of our Detroit Lions. So some bad defense being played in the NFC North this year, but it's pretty close as far as offensive yards per game between the Packers and the Vikings. The Packers average 342 yards per game, the Vikings 354. The Packers doing the bulk of it on the ground. So I think that's one thing that the Packers can benefit from is running the football and kind of keeping the clock moving. I think you might see a little bit lower scoring game in this one. The Packers defense in the second half of games, as of late, anyways, has been really solid. I know they pitched a shutout last week against the Dolphins. They got aided by some pretty poor play from Tua Tagovailoa, but I think the Packers are able to run the football on this Vikings defense. I think they keep the score a little bit lower. I like the Packers in this one. I think probably 21-10, 21-13, something along those lines. If you had to give us a score prediction, where would you fall, Mitch?
yeah, I think that's fair. I'll go a little higher. I'll say 28-17, 28-20, somewhere in that range.
Okay,
I think we do a lot better job on Justin Jefferson. I still think he's going to get his.
sure.
But I do think that you see a lot better offense from Green Bay this time around.
Yeah. So quickly on the playoff race, the Packers at 7-8 can make the playoffs. They do need to win out the last 2 weeks of the year. So they would need to beat Minnesota. They would need to then beat Detroit in week 18. And then they need a little help. So they would need Washington to either lose to Cleveland this week or lose to Dallas in the last week of the year. Or what they can get is if the Giants, if they were to lose both their last two games. So they play Indy and they play at Philadelphia. So it seems like the better bet is to hope for a loss out of Washington I don't know if they necessarily lose to Cleveland, but that game against Dallas could still be important for both of those teams. So I like the Packers' chances to beat Minnesota. I don't know about the Detroit game. I think they would fare better off. Jared Goff on the road and outside doesn't tend to be as strong as Jared Goff at home and in a dome where the temperature is controlled. So if I had to guess, I like the Packers to win out. I don't know if they necessarily get the help they need, though. What do you think? Do you think the Packers can sneak in?
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. And that's why it was like when everyone, this is probably going to be an unpopular take. And I'm surprised I didn't see people kind of shaping their opinion this way, because last week it was all, from kind of the Packer, national media was like everything went the way the Packers did, or the way the Packers needed it to. And I think I was probably playing the schedule game down the road, where I was actually really pulling for the Giants against the Vikings to keep pressure on the Cowboys to having to keep win, because worst case scenario is the Eagles win this week, have the division locked up, and the Giants, or if the Cowboys, they're going to win. They're going to win tonight. If the Cowboys are 2 games up on the Giants, the Cowboys will have that kind of 5th seed locked up, and they can't go down and they can't go up, which would worry me to what's their point of playing anyone against Washington that last week. So I'm with you. I think that the Packers can run the table, and I think we do run the table. My issue is I don't see that if the Cowboys end up resting everyone next week because they're not playing for anything, I don't want it to come down to the fact that we need the Commanders to lose to basically a team of backups. So that
Right.
was kind of my biggest worry, and why I was ultimately rooting for the Giants last week, even though, we're talking about the scenario where if the Giants lose both, we can get in. I just felt like if the Giants could beat the Vikings, the Cowboys would have had to have played everyone that last week, so the Giants couldn't catch them. So
Right.
that's kind of where I'm at. It feels like I don't know if we can have the Commanders. Maybe this is their maybe they lose to a kind of a frisky Cleveland team that can really run the ball, and maybe Deshaun kind of gets his rhythm back. He's looked really rusty since he's came back from his suspension. Maybe
Yeah.
this is the upset that we can kind of get. But to your point, it feels like if we aren't to make the playoffs, it's not going to be because we don't win both of them. It's because we don't get, a loss from the Commanders or 2 losses from the Giants.
Yeah, and it kind of sucks at this point. You're hoping for help, and it's not the position that you want to be in. And
Right.
it's really going to suck if the Packers are in that limbo spot where they were good enough to almost get in. They were really close. Maybe they did what they needed to get in, but they didn't get the help that they needed. So now they're sitting right in the middle of the pack where you didn't quite get in the playoffs. You didn't give yourself a chance, and then you're not getting a great draft pick either. So I mean, it's kind of a tough spot for Packer fans right now. You obviously you want to see them win and you want to see them get in and give themselves a chance, because if we look back to the last time the Packers won a Super Bowl, they snuck in as the 6th seed back then. They were the lowest seed. They went on the road. They won 3 games. They got to the Super Bowl and they won it. So it was improbable. It's improbable now. Do we count out Aaron Rodgers? I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know where to go with that one. I would love to see it happen again. I don't know if he quite has it anymore. I don't know if they have the same kind of team that they did back then. They were kind of really hitting their stride with the squad that they had, especially on offense. But it's going to be interesting. Mitch and I both like the Packers, and we'll lay the 3.5 at Lambeau against the Vikings this week. Any last thoughts on that Packer Viking game, Mitch?
No, I'm just excited. I think you and I both can kind of share the sentiment of the fact that, it's nice to still be playing a meaningful game at this point, given kind of where the mindset was 4 or 5 weeks ago, when it felt, or 3 weeks ago, when it felt like they had absolutely no shot of making the playoffs. So the fact that
Right.
we're now, into week 17 and still have a chance, it makes it exciting. No one wants to watch meaningless football. So the fact that it's primed, it's a 325 nationally televised game against Minnesota with our playoff hopes still kind of on the ropes. It's I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. So let's do a little bit of projecting. Let's guess that the Packers get in. They get the 2 wins that they need. They beat Minnesota. They beat Detroit. They get the help they need. They sneak in. They're the 7 seed, right? I don't see them getting the 6 seed. They're probably going to be that 7 seed. Chances are they end up with either Minnesota or with San Francisco. Uh, Do you give them any kind of chance in either of those games? Obviously, if they meet Minnesota, they will have split with them during the season and played them just a couple of weeks before. Um, So we would like them there maybe. But what do you think about if they were to sneak in and meet either Minnesota or San Francisco and have to go on the road?
Yeah, I think if we play Minnesota, that is a realistic shot of going to US Bank and winning that game. If they do see San Francisco has kind of been our kryptonite, and especially the way
Mhm.
that they play football. And Kyle Shanahan just always seems to have LaFleur's number. I think that's a horrible matchup for us. And that
Agreed.
is just kind of worst case scenario would be us sneaking in and then being greeted by San Francisco to lose by 3 touchdowns because they ran for 500 yards and McCaffrey was averaging 15 yards per carry. It just seems like that would be a very like build your hope up. You got in great, and then you have to go see a team that seemingly killed you in the playoffs for the last decade. So
Yeah. And what you would probably expect is it to look like when we went to San Francisco, was that 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, and got big boyed, by Kyle Shanahan and that run offense. And it would probably look a lot like that Eagles game this year looked, where the Eagles set a franchise rushing record, and it was just demoralizing because the Packers couldn't do anything defensively. I would bet that that's what you see again if we did sneak in and saw San Francisco. And it's just another nail in the coffin for Aaron Rodgers in the playoffs, man. He's gotten his number taken by these teams that are just bigger and more physical and the Packers defense can't hold up.
yeah, and it's like those games as a fan, and I'm sure players feel the same way too, are almost the most frustrating because you know exactly what the opponent's game plan is. You can try to plan for it. You can do whatever you can. You just seemingly can't stop it because they just continue to run for 6 to 8 yards a chunk.
Yep.
That's just by far the most frustrating thing when everyone in the stadium and everyone watching the game knows what's coming and you still can't stop it. So yeah, it's one of those where I want us to get in. If we get in and end up seeing San Francisco, that's going to be it feels like it's going to be a short-lived high, given the fact that San Francisco might break some records on us.
Yeah, I'm with you there. It's going to be interesting. We're all rooting for the Packers. We're excited to see what they can do. I like their chances. We like their chances against Minnesota. I didn't ask you this beforehand, but being that we were talking about San Francisco, do you like them to come out of the NFC, or do you think Brock Purdy is the kryptonite and he eventually brings them down?
Kyle Shanahan probably deserves, he never gets it. It seems like he's always under the radar, but seemingly what he's been able to do, regardless of who his quarterback is year in and year out, he deserves kind of coach of the year recognition seemingly every year.
Yeah.
To your point, I think San Francisco can make a run, and man, would that be a really fun game against, if it ends up being the Eagles versus San Francisco. But to your point, if it came down to QB play and those teams kind of play similar styles, but if I had to pick Jalen Hurts or Brock Purdy, it's obviously a Jalen Hurts no-brainer.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think San Francisco can make a run. It just, to your point, if it gets into a situation where they need a drive where they have to rely on Brock Purdy, I don't know if they can do it.
I'm with you. I'm with you. So yeah, I think the Eagles. I know they're getting kind of banged up at the wrong time, but I think that team is so solid top to bottom. I think they're still the team to beat in the NFC. And at this point, I would still pick them. If Jalen Hurts is good to go and he's ready to rock come playoff time, I think they're the team to beat, and I think they're the team that comes out of the NFC. Even though San Francisco is on a roll right now, man, they've kind of got it all rocking, but yeah, I think Purdy, with his lack of experience, I don't know if he's ready to make a run to the Super Bowl and pull them a ring. I'm not sure he's ready for it.
So you said the Eagles kind of being your team as the NFC. Who do you have then them seeing in the Super Bowl, and who's your ultimate Super Bowl pick?
So I think the AFC playoffs are going to be bonkers. I have no idea what to expect out of that side of the bracket. Um, I love the way the Bengals are playing or were playing until they kind of laid an egg in the second half against New England. So if you had asked me that question last week, I would have probably told you the Bengals just by the way they were playing. Um, but I think if I had to put my money on it, I'd probably take Mahomes and the Chiefs with Andy Reid. I think they're on a run right now, and I think they're in a groove. So I would have to say I would probably take the Chiefs. And if it's the Chiefs and the Eagles, I'm still going to roll with Mahomes and Andy Reid, and I would take the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl.
Yeah, no, that is a safe bet, especially because it feels like every game Mahomes plays, that's kind of a big game. He's out there doing Patrick Mahomes things. So
Yeah,
I
man.
think that's a safe pick. But to your point, AFC, and not to go down to that rabbit hole, you look at kind of some of those teams that are fighting for that 6 and 7 spot, and like the Chargers, and even I know we just beat the Dolphins, and Tua struggled a little bit there, but like the Chargers are such a fascinating team to me because they feel like a team that could lose to anyone, but could also beat anyone just because
Yeah.
Justin Herbert sometimes goes on those runs. And you've seen the Chargers have played some of the top teams in the AFC pretty tough. They have some good wins. So to the Chargers, we talked about, Rodgers going on that run as a low seed. For some reason, if I had to pick a seed below the 5 line or a team below that 5 line, I think the Chargers could be that team that we could see end up being in the AFC Championship and giving, Kansas City or Buffalo or Cincinnati a run for their money.
Oh, I'm with you. And it's going to be really interesting. And I'm really excited because if the Jaguars end up winning that division, which it looks like they will, it would be great to see that 4-5 matchup between Jacksonville and the Chargers because they played early in the season and it was kind of the peak of where the Chargers were really banged up. They had a lot of guys missing in that game, and Jacksonville kind of had their way with the Chargers. We're a long way from that, but I would love to see that as a rematch in the 4-5 slots on the AFC side because I really like Trevor Lawrence, and I really like the fact that they got Doug Peterson in there to be the coach. I think this is kind of his rookie season. If you look at Lawrence, last year was such a mess with Urban Meyer. I like to call this his rookie season, and I think it's gone really well for him. I think he's grown a lot this season, and I think he's only going to keep growing with Peterson at the helm of that team. But I would really like to see that rematch between the Chargers and the Jaguars if that ends up being the case.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. To just watch his progression over the year, he's starting to kind of become that first pick in the draft that kind of everyone expected him as the kind of sure hit, next, young stud quarterback. And
Yeah.
you're starting to see, to your point with Doug Peterson and his offensive mind, how good Trevor Lawrence can be in the trajectory he's on. So the Jags aren't going to go anywhere anytime soon. They're a very young team, and you're starting to see them hit their stride now. So I'm with you.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. We're looking forward to the NFL playoffs. So we'll kind of wrap it up there. I really appreciate you coming on, Mitch. I thank you very much for your time. I want to have you on in the future. I want to get you on and talk some baseball when we get a little bit closer. I want to get your thoughts on the Brewers. We'll see what they do before the season starts, but I want to have you on again.
Yeah, no, I'm always down to talk ball, and hopefully by that point, Mark Antonazio has sold the team. So
Well, we'll keep our eyes peeled. We'll watch for that big news. We'll see what happens. So, thanks again, Mitch. I appreciate you coming on.
thanks, Bill.
All right, have a good night, guys. Thanks for all you for watching or for listening. That matter. I'll post Mitch's info in the details of this the video because if you can follow Mitch on Twitter, he's always got sports knowledge shooting out that Twitter feed. So if you can look him up and give him a follow. So I appreciate you coming on. Everybody have a great night. Thanks for listening.